Hey everybody, Josh Sigurdson of World Alternative Media here, and as many of you guys know, I was recently in Turkey along the southern border, close to the southern border of Turkey and Syria, and I just got back and leave it to me to leave 3 days before a war is declared. Now, we have Josh Friedman joining us. Of course, Josh Friedman has a great YouTube channel and many other hats in media that everyone should check out, and we'll get into that a bit later. But first, thank you for joining us, Josh.
Thank you for having me, and pretty interesting timing, as you noted.
Yeah, so Josh and I were just recently driving around Turkey. We rented a vehicle and ended up going to a bunch of sites, totally off topic, to ancient sites and stuff throughout Turkey. There's no shortage of them. And we were just thinking, you know, it just seems like the country's getting better and better and things are picking up again. And it's easy to speak too soon when it comes to Turkey because 3 days after I found myself back in the United States and Josh took off from Turkey, the news hits and there's a war declared between Erdogan and the Kurdish people in Syria. Now, of course, this is a war that's been ongoing for a long time, but nonetheless, this is the latest offensive, and I wanted to go into this a bit with you, Josh. Can you explain for the audience in the simple as possible? I know it's a very complicated issue, but in the simplest terms possible, kind of the history of Erdogan and the Kurdish people on this this divide between the Kurds and the Turks.
Well, it's not so simple, and I don't know how far you want to go back, but maybe we'll go back about, say, 5 years. And actually, Erdogan was pretty instrumental in there being peace, let's call it. There was a truce, and going back about 5 years or so, and it held for a couple of years. But then in 2015, things started heating up again, and following this bombing in a Turkish border town right around where we just were, the town called Suruç. There was a bombing there that was claimed by ISIS, and following that, the truce blew up, and Turkey responded by attacking, it claimed ISIS, but also the Kurds, and dropping bombs in both northern Iraq and northern Syria. And ever since then, there have been a few offensives, as you have noted. So there were in 2016, there was one, I believe, that was Operation Euphrates Shield, when Turkey actually went into northern Syria, and then again in early last year, in early 2018. So now this is actually Turkey's third offensive into northern Syria, going after predominantly Kurdish militants, predominantly the YPG. That's the military branch of the Kurds in northern Syria. So actually this has been going on for some time, and as you've noted, there's been a hot war, or on and off hot war, between the Turks and the Kurds, primarily between the Turks and the PKK. That's the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which is primarily or historically been centered in Turkey. And that's been going on for several decades, but over the past 5 years or so, I guess maybe 3 or 4, there's been a lot more action involving the Syrian Kurds. But it hasn't gotten nearly as much media attention as it has now. And I would argue, and probably you would argue, that has a lot to do with the fact that now Donald Trump has entered the fray.
Yeah, Donald Trump is good at making news, that's for sure. And we'll get into that in a moment. But I do want to mention, when we were in Adana in southern Turkey, the day that we were there, we had just left, and then we found out there was a roadside bomb that went off that hit police in Adana, and it was blamed on the Kurdish people, of course. And this seems to have somehow played into this rather quick push towards suddenly going from kind of like a cold-ish war, though there's a lot of opponents still locked in prison and a lot of people are still getting arrested en masse in Turkey. This seemed to quickly shift the tide a little bit, And we were in Haran, and we weren't far from a town called Tal Abyad. And Tal Abyad in 2015 was, of course, taken by the Kurdish people, and it's been held ever since. And a lot of the shelling that's been happening in recent days has been happening in that town. I remember we actually considered for a few moments maybe going over there, but little did we know this was going to, happen within about a week. But this kind of plays into another example of how complicated this is, because there's been bombings on and off for years. Some people say it's Erdogan blaming the Kurdish people. Some people say it's the Kurdish people attacking the Turkish government. It might be a little bit of both. But what I've seen most notably is the U.S. media taking the story and kind of running with it. And you hear Donald Trump coming forward with all these, he got the biggest hashtag on Twitter the other day was Trump betrayed the Kurds. And it was basically a bunch of people who said that we want war in Syria and we want U.S. troops in the Middle East, versus people who are against that. And this is where it gets so complicated, because obviously we don't want to see the Kurdish people get blown up, and the Turkish government is extremely corrupt. I mean, how do you even piece this together at this point? It just seems so over the top crazy.
Well, yeah, actually, if indeed the U.S. were pulling out, which it's not so clear if that's the case, and there's a lot of indication that's not the case, but let's say hypothetically the U.S. were pulling out, then the vacuum would get filled by countries like Turkey, Iran, Russia.
Mm-hmm.
They're going to be militaries, and they're going to be proxy groups, and there are lots of guys in there fighting it out. So I wouldn't expect there to be peace just if the U.S. suddenly pulled out. And as we're seeing, there's quite a lot of pushback from Washington against Trump, and pushback in favor of keeping U.S. troops there in Syria. And I apparently there's even breaking news now relating to some U.S. troops coming under Turkish fire. But I think regardless, there are major competing interests in Syria, and the fighting is nowhere near coming to an end.
Yeah, and we were just talking as well about how the tourism is starting to pick up in Syria, and of course this happens now. As you alluded to, Turkey mistakenly bombed U.S. Special Forces in Syria, according to the Pentagon official and an Iraqi Kurdish intelligence official. And of course, this is all part of what they call the new Operation Peace Spring. So I want to kind of go into this a little bit, because Donald Trump has been saying that if they go too far, that there will be crippling economic sanctions placed on Turkey. Erdogan is also saying at the same time that he will unleash refugees on countries that try to intervene and continuously, what he calls, lie about the reality of what he's doing in Syria. Do you think that this issue is going to get any hotter than it is? I mean, and I know it's hard to say, but we've heard so many of these things happen over the years. I remember the attempted coup against Erdogan, and everyone thought it was going to turn into this madness where Turkey would completely fall. And here we are several years later talking about it. How big do you think this really is, or is the media just kind of propping it up as almost a tool at this point?
It's big, but then at the same time, I think it's become a media circus because of Trump's involvement and because of how the media clashes with Trump. So this is an angle, the angle, as you mentioned, the Trump betrayed the Kurds. It's an angle for major Western media that's clashing with Trump to seize on, and they can run with it. But at the same time, there are major issues at play, as you're noting. There's very much been a clash between the U.S. and Turkey over a host of issues, over Turkey's purchase of the Russian S-400 missile defense system, over the U.S. protecting Fethullah Gulen, who Turkey accuses of masterminding the coup attempt, of course, over the Syrian Kurds. And over the past several years, the U.S. and Turkey have been at each other's throats at certain times. And maybe things will calm down pretty soon, but there are also long-term implications to this. You were noting the economic matter. So Trump has been making some rather inflammatory comments and tweets this week, and he's been threatening Turkey with economic punishment. And while he did make some, he made some comments like he was going to say threatening he has already obliterated the Turkish economy, and he might do it again. Now that
He's
might
not
be
entirely wrong there.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. That's what I'm getting at. It might be
Yeah.
hyperbole, but it's not an empty threat. If you go back to last summer, August 2018, there was the American pastor Andrew Brunson. He had been in Turkish jail for, I think, a couple years or more at that point, and Trump finally decided enough was enough, and he wanted him out. And the Trump administration slapped Turkey with some sanctions, and Trump started actually bad talking the lira on Twitter, and lo and behold, the lira plunged. The lira plunged to about 6.5 to the dollar, and this is a currency that was around 2 to the dollar about five or more years ago. And granted, there are a lot more factors that play into this inflation than just the latest spat between Trump and Erdogan. But this is a long-term major problem for both Erdogan and Turkey, and it's something that's actually becoming visible in Turkish domestic politics. So earlier this year, Erdogan had his first ever really major electoral setbacks. He lost Ankara and he lost Istanbul, even though he forced a rerun of the Istanbul mayoral election. He ended up losing Istanbul,
which are the two biggest cities in Turkey, of course.
But it's specifically in Turkey, the saying goes like, so goes Istanbul, so goes Turkey. And it's very representative of the direction of the country. Mm-hmm. So when Erdogan lost Istanbul, it was a huge political loss. And to some extent, at least in my opinion, and having spent a lot of time in the country recently, it's got something to do with the average Turkish citizen really feeling the brunt of all this inflation and of the recent recession. So these economic threats that Trump is making could have really long-term major implications.
Yeah, so I mean, right after you left, Josh, I talked with a Kurdish man in Istanbul, and he really liked to talk. He really wanted to tell us everything political under the sun, because I think he was trying to practice his English, honestly. And he starts going into how, all governments are puppets, all governments are just villains, and they want to destroy us. But he said, I'm friends with Turkish people as a Kurdish man, and I have nothing against the Turkish people, the people who speak Turkish, versus, he's like, I speak Turkish, but I'm also Kurdish. And he kind of went into all these things, and his sentiment was that what you see is basically a government clashing against government in a way, and the people are suffering at the bottom of the chain. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, because I don't know, he was just some guy in Istanbul that he said he came from Diyarbakir originally, and as a Kurdish person, he had a lot to say on the subject matter. What do you think about, I guess the culture around there between the Turkish people and the Kurdish people, and, the friendships between them? Because it doesn't seem on the ground like everyone's fighting each other.
Well, it depends. You come across a whole lot of sentiments. If you're walking around Diyarbakir, I haven't spent a lot of time there, but I have been there. I think you're going to come across a lot of support for the PKK, outright support. And, by U.S., even according to the U.S., the PKK is a terror group, and it's carried out bombings across Turkey for decades. But then again, in many places in Turkey, you're going to find Turks and Kurds working side by side. I mean, there are many Kurds who have supported Erdogan for years. There are a whole variety of sentiments. As to your point of, it's like people on the ground are being forced to deal with the effects of one government clashing with another. In a sense, it's even worse than that, because you've got one government clashing with another, and a government clashing with a militant group, and another militant group getting involved. And so, yeah, there are all these factions and governments that are fighting with one another, and the little guy ends up getting the short end of the stick quite a lot of the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, over the years, this has been becoming a bigger and bigger issue. Of course, we can look at things like Iraqi Kurdistan. There is a huge movement that's been going on for a long time, but it's certainly growing in momentum in the last several years towards the Kurdish people. We see that in Syria, we see that in Iraq, and we certainly see that in Turkey. And I mean, my perspective is that obviously the U.S. should not be in Syria and should not be the policeman of the world, as we all, I think most of us would agree. That with that said, that doesn't change the fact that it's really sad to see so many people getting locked up in cages, so many political opponents getting disappeared. I mean, you were in the worst part of it, I think, over the last several years when you went there a few years ago and were going across the country by bus, and you had some pretty scary experiences around there. Would you mind going into a little bit of that for us?
Sure. Well, this was one time, so I don't know how reflective it was of over the course of several years, but this was back in 2017, right around when they were having a referendum on changing Turkey from a parliamentary system to a presidential system. And yeah, I was traveling around the southeast by bus at the time, which probably wasn't the wisest idea. And there were military checkpoints all over the place, and it wasn't like when we were cruising around a week or two ago that the checkpoints were manned. Sometimes they're heavily armed. Every time you hit a checkpoint, there's Turkish police or military coming onto the bus and basically checking everyone out, maybe looking in some database to see if they're naughty or nice. I don't know exactly how it works, but yeah, pretty intimidating, I would say, to some. But back then, there was some hot fighting within the borders of Turkey. I mean, including street fighting between the PKK and its offshoots and the Turkish military. You actually had in certain cities in the southeast kids in the street in trenches firing against Turkish military, and I mean, I didn't get to see that with my own eyes, but it was
probably lucky for you.
Yeah, probably. I don't know if I would have been ready for that, or if I would have escaped it. But yeah, I mean, it goes to show how complex this conflict is. There's fighting and there are terror attacks within Turkey, in Syria, in Iraq, spread across the region, and it seems to shift from one place to another to another.
It's a really strange thing because you hear so many stories of these bombings and all these attacks and terrorists in the region, and ISIS has mostly dried up at this point for the most part. Obviously, there's always something else up.
We'll see. I mean,
yeah, there's always something up their sleeves.
It's the argument coming from pretty much the foreign policy establishment in Washington right now is that if Trump allows Turkey to do what it's doing right now, which is attacking the Syrian Kurds and driving them out of their positions, then this risks ending up in a situation where a bunch of jailed ISIS fighters break free and run wild. Now,
yeah.
I don't know if it's going to happen, but it will be interesting to see what indeed does happen with regard to these ISIS fighters in the coming days and weeks.
It's so sad to watch this region have to deal with so many problems. It's always been happening since as long as humans have been there. And, you know, it's such an amazing place. That's what I was kind of getting at, was that, you know, you drive around the place and it's as first world as it gets. I mean, the roads in Turkey are, in my opinion, much better than the roads in the United States. The infrastructure is quite nice. You go around, there's nice people everywhere. Things are incredibly cheap, but not for good reasons. Obviously, the lira has been suffering for quite some time, but I mean, it's just overall, it was an amazing experience for me going around Turkey. It's a beautiful country. It's probably one of my favorite countries I've ever been to. And at the same time, you have all these problems, and at the same time as all these things are happening, you have Trump saying, well, you know, the Kurds didn't help us in World War II, or, well, you know, they've been fighting for 200 years. And that is a simple side of the argument. But as we see, it is extremely complicated. There's drama left and right. And it's hard to even get to the bottom of this situation because it's so deep rooted, going back hundreds of years. And it's just, again, it's governments and, as you mentioned, militant groups and other governments, etc., fighting each other. But I have to ask, going forward, do you think Erdogan has a chance of, making it out scot-free in the next 10 years? It seems like he's starting to gain enemies left and right, and it just seems like he isn't going in a very good direction for himself.
Well, you're right in that he's got a whole bunch of problems. So I already addressed somewhat the domestic situation. His political hand has been weakened.
Yeah.
I think the farther he pushes into Syria, the more he's going to come up against Putin and the Russian military and possibly Iran and other forces who are not on his side in Syria as much as they try to cooperate. And maybe the U.S. gets involved again with its troops in Syria. Maybe not. Maybe the U.S. indeed, as we were discussing, hits Turkey hard with sanctions and devalues the lira and causes more economic problems for Erdogan. So there's a lot that he's faced with. But at the same time, he seems to be calling on a trusted strategy or a trusted play or game plan of his. So if you look back to 2015, in June 2015, his ruling Justice and Development Party lost their parliamentary majority in the Turkish election. And that was back before the country changed to a presidential system. And that was a huge loss for him. And he basically wouldn't recognize the election. He insisted that they not form a government and they have a redo election. And then in the meanwhile, in those few months between the initial election and the redo election, that's when all the fighting broke out. That's when the ceasefire ended, and that's when the fighting broke out between Turks and Kurds. And what I saw was basically Erdogan establishing order out of chaos. It really worked. It worked in 2015, and then it worked again, I would say, in 2017 in the aftermath of the coup attempt. So Erdogan made use of the chaos and the fear that was spread across Turkish society during the coup attempt, and he parlayed that into pushing ahead with the referendum and ultimately succeeding with the referendum to establish this executive presidency. So I've seen Erdogan, who's really a masterful politician, succeed multiple times with what I say is bringing order out of chaos. So that could be his strategy right now.
Do you think, where do you think this is going to end up going? I know it's a crapshoot to try and actually predict what's going to happen next, but I mean, it seems like the popularity is definitely on, I don't even know, because it depends who you talk to. What do you think, as someone that's been around Turkey so many times and has experienced a culture and has told the news and reported the news in Turkey, which direction do you think this is generally going in?
Which direction, that what is generally going?
Which direction do you believe the country is going in? Do you think that we're going to see it get more chaotic? Do you think we're going to see more fighting? Do you think we're going to see more insurgents, etc.? Or do you think this is going to teeter off and be more of a peaceful resolve situation going forward?
Well, I think Erdogan might have to keep resorting to the order out of chaos formula if he's going to retain power in the long term, because his grip on power has been slipping for the various reasons that we've been discussing. But if you look at the progression of these recent offensives, they haven't lasted forever. So there was Operation Euphrates Shield and Operation Olive Branch. I think that was the one last year into the Syrian city of Afrin. They last several months and then they end, and then Turkey starts planning a new offensive. And this one might be more serious than the previous ones, but again, Turkey and the Turkish military can run up against other very powerful factions and militaries in Syria, especially including Russia. So, I mean, it's not like Turkey can just march on into Damascus now and overthrow Assad. So, but they've made it clear that Erdogan's made it clear that he's trying to set up the safe zone, and he's got a plan for trying to resettle the Syrian refugees that are currently in Turkey, resettling them in northern Syria and changing the demographics. So we'll see what happens, but probably nothing too far different from what we've already seen before.
Yeah, he's wielding his power and enforcing his agenda. But yeah, that's an important point that you make there. I mean, I can't really see Erdogan marching into Damascus. And I think that is a lot of the assumptions that have been coming up in the media. I saw today on The View, Rand Paul was on. He was getting his head bit off by Meghan McCain. And, you know, I'm hearing a lot of stuff within the media about how this is going to turn into like a massive nuclear war of some kind. And I feel like this is just business as usual in a lot of ways. And as you kind of mentioned, it might be a bit more serious than before. But I hope to see calm prevail overall. It's a beautiful country. It's an amazing place, and it has amazing culture and amazing history, as does Armenia, which I can't go without mentioning in this video. But you know, people are going to get mad if I don't mention that, and I think that is important. But with that said, Josh, as we close this off, I appreciate you joining us. This is so complicated. It's impossible to get to the bottom of in one video. In fact, in 10 videos, you'd hardly scratch the surface because it is such a deep-rooted issue. But on the simple side, as simplistic as it gets, there are factions fighting against factions, and the U.S. is trying to get involved, or isn't it being involved? And then there's war hawks shouting for him to get involved, and it's just a drama as usual, as we see in the political realm, and as we're so used to with all of this, and a lot of confusion, of course, in the media. But with that said, finishing this off, can you let everyone know where they can find more of your work and follow this, and also try and get to the bottom a little bit better of this incredibly complex issue? Is there anyone that people should check out and follow? Can you go into that?
Well, actually, if you're not a Turkish speaker, and I myself am not a Turkish speaker, it's a little complicated nowadays. There's been quite a government takeover of media in Turkey, and I don't feel so comfortable just recommending one news source or another regarding this. But yeah, I mean, it helps to take in a variety of perspectives. I remember you and I were actually watching TRT, the Turkish state broadcaster, in one of the cities when we were at our hotel. And so, yeah, I try to get the Turkish state perspective on things, the Russian state perspective on things, the Iranian state perspective, try to follow some Kurdish media, and, you know, get all kinds of different perspectives. And more importantly, at least for me, is being there in Turkey as often as possible, and in neighboring countries, and talking to as many people as possible, and being there on the ground and seeing things and hearing sentiments from people, and trying to sort things out, going about it that way.
Yeah, I didn't even know there were still Kurdish medias left after the takedown. But anyway, I mean, that's one of the things that I appreciate about your journalism, is that you aren't willing to go as deep into things unless you've been to the country and have seen it for yourself, and you don't speculate much. You go to the scene of the crime, I guess you could say, and try to report on it from that perspective. So that's what I appreciate hearing from you. So where can people find more of your work?
You can find me on YouTube at youtube.com/Josh Friedman FMP.
All right, excellent. Well, we'll try and get updates from you on this story as time goes by, and Hopefully, as I said before, calm prevails. You never know in politics. But anyway, we'll be back to you guys with much more. I mean, we got a bunch of videos coming from Turkey, not on this particular subject, because again, the second I left Turkey, there was a war declared. So that's the way it goes in the Middle East, I guess you could say. You never know what's going to happen next. And you know, I was planning a trip to Syria and Iraq right away, but it's getting a little bit more daunting, but that's not going to stop me. So make sure to check below those links and help send me there, because I am still willing to go. I know there's kind of a revolution happening in Iraq as well. Lots of protesters have been shot and killed, and there's always something happening in that region, and it's important to try and get to the bottom of it as much as humanly possible. So I appreciate you guys watching. I apologize for not getting a video out on this sooner. It has been crazy ever since getting back from Turkey. So we'll try to follow this story as much as humanly possible going forward. Thanks, Josh, for joining us again. And until next time, this is Josh Sigurdson signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change. Like what you see here at Wham! Don't forget to check the links below. GoFundMe, Patreon. We cannot do it without you guys. Every donation is extremely, extremely appreciated, as we're getting incredibly shadow banned. We've lost 80% of our audience since January of 2019 and counting. They are ripping us apart here on YouTube, and the only thing we could do in the meantime as we prepare for the next big step is to ask for help from the viewers that support our free information that we try to post on a daily basis. You can also find us on Subscribestar, where just $1 a month, that's all it takes, $1 a month is all it takes to truly make a huge difference. If everyone gave $1 a month, it would change everything for independent media, and we could win this information war, and we can defeat the mainstream medias eventually. And of course, on Subscribestar, we post subscriber-only content that you'll only see on Subscribestar. So make sure to pledge there, become a patron. That makes a huge difference, guys. And also, don't forget to check out our Bitcoin address below in the comments and description, as well as on the screen for you to scan, if you please. And also, don't forget to subscribe to us on the alternatives. We will likely be deleted by YouTube in the next 2 years. It's already happening on a vast scale. So make sure to find us on float.app. That's flote.app. At Josh Sigurdson, as well as at Wham, W-A-M. Float.app is replacing every social media, and I mean, it's just incredible the opportunities it provides for not just creators, but for the average person who wants to get away from these nannies telling them what they can or cannot see. They plan to replace Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Twitch, Tumblr, Reddit, and Patreon. You could subscribe to us on Float and pledge with cryptocurrency. It's really innovative. We are also on BitChute at World Alternative Media, as well as so many others, Minds, PocketNet. You can find us at World Alternative Media on Instagram. There's many options. And finally, don't forget to join us at Anarchapulco 2020, the famous event, the best liberty event known to mankind, other than perhaps Anarcho Vegas 2020. There are 2 major events coming up that we are extremely excited about, and you can use promo code WHAM, that's W-A-M, and save 10% on your tickets to these legendary conferences. There's so many amazing people speaking there. You won't want to miss it. So make sure to support in any way you can, even if it's just sharing our videos, pressing like, pressing to be notified. Anything helps, folks. You are the change you wish to see. Thanks for watching, everyone. And until next time, this is Josh Sigurdson signing out from World Alternative Media. Find the truth, be the change.
I'm sure you have already changed people's minds in your young age because you're involved, and I like that.
Wow.